The US wasn't an imperialist power in 1823 when Monroe issued his Monroe Doctrine. I'm going to show you the truth about how the US developed itself into a world power. And it's going to contradict everything you thought you knew, whether you're a radical leftist or a free market libertarian. In the same exact speech in which he issued his doctrine, Monroe called for the construction of the nation's mega canals, inspired by the successful construction of the nation's first mega canal, the Erie Canal, by Governor Clinton in New York State. Most people don't know that these government-initiated mega canals were what created cities beyond the Appalachian Mountains. That's right. The almighty USA hadn't developed a single city beyond the Appalachian Mountains at the time of Monroe's Doctrine. The entire country was pretty much relegated to the East Coast because of mountains. But that's the truth. The Appalachian Mountains were a huge hurdle to expansion at that time. They didn't have a fast way of carrying large amounts of goods over the mountains. All they had were horses pulling carts on wooden wheels. The great shift towards the government investing in mega infrastructure projects, which Monroe was initiating in this very speech, is what conquered this Appalachian Mountain problem and got commerce between East and West moving 100 times faster. And it essentially created our Midwestern cities, which then went on to become the industrial heartland of America. And you can just Google population data of these Midwestern cities to see what I'm talking about. Like Buffalo here. In 1820, it had 2,000 residents. Then in 1825, the Erie Canal opened. 5 years later, it had almost 9,000 people. And then by 1840, double that. Pittsburgh in 1820, we see it had 7,000 residents. By 1840, it had 20,000. Chicago, which is much further west than Buffalo or Pittsburgh, so canals reached it a bit later, 5,000 people in 1840. 10 years later, 30,000 people. And then in 1860, it jumps all the way to 112,000 because railroads had reached it by that time. So railroads usurped canals as the nation's mode of shipping cargo by the 1850s. And it was government legislatures who initiated the construction of the first major railroads as well. Now, you can compare these Midwest cities to East Coast cities and their populations. Like Boston already had 40,000 residents in 1820. Philly had 60,000, and New York had 120,000. On this map of 1840 roads and waterways, the canals are the gray dotted lines. And you can see that down in the south, there were no major canals. You can see it a little clearer on this map without the roadways, just canals and rivers. They didn't even bother including anything south of Virginia because the South didn't build any canals. Essentially, the Southern slavery oligarchy was not interested in development. They weren't joining in the canal craze that we see up in the industrious northern states like New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, which shows us that wealth through slavery and cotton was not the reason the US developed. Otherwise, the South would have developed real cities to the west by 1840, just as the North did. Development of undeveloped nations has to come from concerted efforts from the government legislature to build infrastructure and nurture infant industries. It doesn't just magically appear through the accumulation of wealth through slavery, cotton, opium, imperialism, nor through the taking of indigenous lands. And we see wealth without development not just in the southern US, but all over Latin America as well. There was plenty of wealth through slavery, dirt cheap labor, gold, sugar, cotton, and taking of indigenous lands down there too, but very little industry and infrastructure. There was a political faction in 1800s America that understood the need for direct government intervention and investment in infrastructure and in the economy in order to stimulate industrial development. Back then, and especially in the nation's first 100 years, they thought less in terms of spending on social services and more in terms of spending on infrastructure. To build or not to build, that was the political battleground in 1800s America. So this pro-development faction returned to power in 1817 after 16 years of laissez-faire economics under representatives of the slavery oligarchy, Madison and Jefferson, who had by and large stunted the nation's development. And by 1815, the whole nation knew their economic program had failed miserably. The pro-development faction, ranging from Alexander Hamilton to Ulysses S. Grant, is important to know about because their policies give us an example of an undeveloped nation developing despite a world hegemon trying to keep them undeveloped. I talk about these themes more in depth in these videos. And I'll make a little playlist on my channel where you can find any new videos I put out on the subject of the pro-development faction in 1800s America. Please subscribe and like.